I should say firstly that I'm very grateful to Minister Brendan Howlin, Ombudsman and Information Commissioner Emily O'Reilly, and Bob Semple, partner of PricewaterhouseCoopers in Ireland, for agreeing to help us launch this service, and whose experiences and insights should help in making the case for this and other initiatives aimed at making Ireland a fairer and more open place. I'm also very happy to see so many friends of Transparency International Ireland here, including Bernadette Sullivan, Eugene McAleen, I've seen walking around somewhere, and Noel Wardick. We'll have time after our presentations to hear from some of our audience and what you expect from us. But before I go any further, I should like to say a few brief words about another friend of Transparency International Ireland. I was working in New Zealand in 2002 when I first heard of Transparency. An article appeared in the New Zealand Herald saying how corrupt Ireland was. And it wasn't so long after that an article appeared in the Irish Times written by Garrett Fitzgerald calling for the launch of a chapter of TI here. He noted, and I quote, that TI was having an increasing impact on corruption around the world, but lamented the fact that there was no chapter in Ireland. When I got back from New Zealand, I tracked Garrett down, and soon after, from his kitchen in Ranelagh, we held the first meeting of what was to become the first chapter here. Much has been said of Garrett's personal integrity, his contribution to peace in Ireland, and his influence in Irish society. Likewise, his influence on me and everyone who pursues this cause will, I hope, endure in our work for years to come. I should give you a run-through of tonight's events, of the schedule for this evening. We'll start with a few words and thoughts from the Minister. He will be followed by Emily O'Reilly, who will be talking about the value of information in holding government to account. And we'll hear from Bob Semple, who has a long and illustrious track record in tackling white-collar crime. Before I turn to the Minister, again, delighted to see everyone here. We'll try and wrap up in time so that you have time to share your thoughts and comments and questions on the service. I'll be talking about the service as well. And then afterwards we'll have a glass of wine together, I hope. Minister, I'll turn to you. Thank you very much.
Good evening. Good evening, Chair, Ombudsman, ladies and gentlemen. I'm genuinely delighted to have been asked here this evening at the launch of Speak Up, the helpline, and the Advice Centre. I want to commend Transparency International on this important initiative, which I've just been informed, I think, is the first in Western Europe. And I note the international dimension to track and the support provided by the European Commission. I'm also impressed by the ambition behind the project. It seeks to achieve a number of high-level objectives: a change in behaviour and attitudes towards wrongdoing in Irish public and corporate life. God knows that change is required. A radical change in company behaviour with the introduction of comprehensive whistleblower legislation. And thirdly, a safer environment for people to speak up about wrongdoing in the workplace or in public life that they perceive. I note in particular the private and public sector scope of this initiative. This disposition reflects the universal approach which is already in force in the United Kingdom. There, the key piece of whistleblowing legislation is the Public Interest Disclosure Act of 1998. This applies to almost all workers and employees who ordinarily work in the United Kingdom. The situation covers including criminal offences, risks to health and safety, failure to comply with a legal obligation, a miscarriage of justice, or environmental damage. Of particular interest to everyone here, especially since, I suppose, we're all still reflecting on last week's visit by Her Majesty the Queen, is that part of this island is fully covered under the universal legal whistleblower protection. The protections available to all UK employees under the UK Act were given legal effect in Northern Ireland by the Public Interest Disclosure Northern Ireland Order of 1998 and came into operation there on the 31st of October of 1999. That order offers a framework of protection against victimisation or dismissal of workers who blow the whistle on criminal behaviour or wrongdoing as defined in that legislation. All employees and other whistleblowers protected under that Act are given equal protection. That same protection is not available to date in this jurisdiction. As most of the audience here is aware, in 2006, a sector-by-sector approach to whistleblowing was adopted by the then government. While some significant sectors have already been covered under this piecemeal sector-by-sector approach, the effect of the implementation of the policy by the previous administration is as follows. Substantial sectors are not covered at all. No public database is available on the coverage of employees under whistleblower legislation. No government department is responsible for monitoring the implementation of the overall legislation. A universal legal charter has not been put in place in Ireland for the protection of all persons reporting concerns in good faith and the facilitation of highlighting risks, especially those caused by wrongdoing. Only partial coverage of our workforce has been provided for under the sectoral approach that has been the policy up to now. A sector-by-sector approach is in operation with no overriding or framework provisions for the protection of whistleblowers and for the communication of risk. The Speak Up Helpline at the Track Resource Centre will ensure that for the future a database of casework will be available. This will be of assistance and benefit to all employees and to all citizens. It is clearly as important in the private as well as in the public sphere that all our citizens and all employees are equally protected under a universal legal charter governing the communication of risk. The high-level objectives adopted by TRAC dovetail neatly in this regard with the ambitious programme of national reform and renewal set out in the programme for government agreed by Fine Gael and the Labour Party. The government's programme for reform and for the establishment of open government takes as its starting point that the failures of the past can never be allowed to happen again. The Open Government Reform Initiative encompasses constitutional, political, parliamentary, administrative, public sector and corporate sector reform. The individual elements are well understood within and without the governance and institutional structures. This is the most ambitious whole-of-government reform ever contemplated in the history of the state. The scale of the crisis and of the financial burden placed by the unaccountable few on the backs of the majority of the citizens of this country demands nothing less. 4 particular elements in the programme I think will be of interest to this audience. Firstly, good faith reporting and protected disclosure, advancement of freedom of information, reform, and I'd say this finally the Ombudsman will be delighted to hear, of the Ombudsman Act, long promised and long fingered by the previous administration, will happen, and the dealing with the issues of conflict of interest. Some of these areas are within the particular area of responsibility of the Office of the Information Commissioner and Ombudsman here present. Others are related but impinge on the Information Commissioner's role. I'm particularly pleased to share a platform tonight with Commissioner and Ombudsman Emily O'Reilly. I'd like to commend her and her staff for their tireless, often thankless, but hugely significant and influential work over the years. Her office has been a strong and positive influence on the lives of many individual citizens in our state and on governance generally. The commitments in the programme for government are quite specific in regard to whistleblowing. It states the government will introduce whistleblowers legislation, and I'd like to confirm that commitment that we will legislate to protect whistleblowers who speak out against wrongdoing or cover up, whether in the public or in the private sector. And I can say that as a whistleblower myself, who ended up for my pains in both the High and Supreme Courts in this land. I envisage that the whistleblower protection for public servants that expose maladministration by ministers or others who sit within framework legislation, providing a universal legal charter of good faith reporting and protected disclosure for all employees and for others. I envisage that the framework legislation will be analogous to that exists in the United Kingdom, will govern public and private sector employees and other relevant actors equally and fairly within one overall legal framework that governs all activities transparently and openly. The programme for government provides that the government will legislate, and I quote, to restore the Freedom of Information Act to what it was before it was undermined by the outgoing government, end quote, and that it will extend the remit to other public bodies, including the administrative side of An Garda Síochána, subject only to security exceptions. It also proposes, that is the programme for government, to extend freedom of information and the Ombudsman's Act to ensure that all statutory bodies and all bodies significantly funded by the public purse are covered. Considerable work is already underway within my department to advance this agenda. A number of points are worth summarising. A preliminary examination of the implications of restoring the 2003 Amendment Act and extending FOI to all bodies substantially funded from the public purse is, as I say, well advanced. Clearly, legislation will be needed to give effect to the provisions in these clearly stated commitments. Work is also continuing on bringing the administrative aspects of Garda operations within the scope of the Freedom of Information Act. A full assessment of the bodies, either fully or partially funded by the Exchequer, will be necessary so that proposals can be submitted to government on the scope of the extension that will be made. It should be noted that there are already more than 500 bodies covered by FOI. The proposals in relation to the extension of the Act will also necessitate consideration of the position of the Central Bank, the Financial Services Authority, NAMA and the NTMA, and other specifically important bodies, including those under the aegis of the Department of Justice. The views of the relevant ministers are being sought right now. It should be noted that the extension of the Act to all bodies, and I quote again, all bodies significantly funded from the public purse, has major administrative and other implications that will need to be fully addressed, but will be fully addressed. I expect to submit initial proposals to government in relation to how these matters should be progressed shortly. It is, however, important that we get this issue right from the start. For that reason, it is important, as I say, all ministers are consulted on, firstly, the effective repeal of the previous government's 2003 Amendment Act, what it means for them. That discussion is underway. The inclusion of all statutory bodies, including those statutory bodies under the aegis of the Department of Finance and the Department of Justice and Equality in particular. And finally, the identification of any other concerns that may exist in relation to the impact of the FOI Act on the discharge of government business. I propose to do this shortly, following the presentation of my initial paper to government. The programme for government also contains a commitment, as I say, to extend the remit of the Ombudsman. The extension of the Ombudsman's remit will be an important milestone in the policy of increasing transparency and accountability in public administration, and will allow citizens to challenge the decisions of state bodies where they consider they have been treated unfairly. this government is committed to extending the powers of the Ombudsman to cover new bodies which are outside her current remit. This means that the administrative actions of many more bodies that were previously not subject to investigation by the Ombudsman will be open to impartial and independent scrutiny and oversight. The programme for government provides a commitment for the amendment of the rules to ensure that no senior public servant, including political appointees, or minister can work in the private sector in any area involving a potential conflict of interest with their former area of public employment until at least 2 years have lapsed after they've left public service. The work to bring this forward will involve an amendment to the Civil Service Code of Standards and Behaviour and analogous codes of standard and behaviour in certain sectors of the public sector. Its inclusion in a draft code of standards of behaviour for public servants who work in areas not covered by those codes. I expect that those relevant codes will be amended by year's end, subject again to consultation with the relevant staff representatives. People will know here that in order to drive this extraordinarily demanding agenda of constitutional, political, administrative reform, we have established a Department of State at cabinet rank that is now entitled the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, and the reform element of that title is extremely important. As of this minute, I am only quasi-legal. The enactment of the legislation to formally establish the department will come before the Oireachtas next week. But in the meanwhile, you can be assured that I am acting as if I had that authority because the government wants me to. In summary, the initiative by Transparency International is timely and welcome, and it is a significant addition to the architecture in this important area of change. The government is determined to deliver on its open government agenda. We are at an early stage, obviously, of the process. We are less than 12 weeks in office. I've outlined the state of play in regard to the 4 key components of the open government agenda of particular interest to this audience. But there are others. We will be, for example, bringing in a Register of Lobbyists Act to ensure that anybody who makes contact or wishes to lobby either departments or ministers or senior civil servants or committees of the Oireachtas will have to be registered so that people will know who has influence on these matters. The government hopes to make substantial progress on all these issues before year's end and is committed to achieving the ambitious, full reform programme outlined in the programme for government before the end of this term of Dáil Éireann. Gur magat.